My uncle didn't just steal what my grandfather had spent 40 years building. He stole 5 years of my life. I can still hear the judge's voice the morning she read the verdict. Guilty on all counts of fraud, over $5,000, and breach of trust. The words landed in the courtroom like something physical. My grandfather had been a careful, honest man who never once took a shortcut, and in less than 20 minutes, 12 strangers decided I had dismantled everything he stood for. I looked back across the courtroom at my uncle before the officer reached for my wrists. He wasn't crying. He wasn't relieved. He simply reached over and squeezed my aunt's hand once, slowly, and gave a small nod that lasted maybe 3 seconds before he looked away. Nobody else seemed to notice. I never stopped thinking about it. My name is Jenna Wald, and until I was 31 years old, I believed that family was the one thing that did not require a backup plan. My grandfather spent 4 decades quietly building a portfolio of commercial rental properties in and around Ottawa. Nothing glamorous, a few strip plazas off the highway near Canada, some small office suites in the West End, a pair of warehouse units out past Stittsville. He managed every property himself well into his late 70s, driving his old Silverado out to inspect the lots, reviewing leases at the kitchen table, keeping his records by hand in thick leather-bound ledgers that he dated and stored in careful chronological order on a shelf in his study. By the time he was 82, the portfolio had grown to just over $4 million. He never talked about the money. He talked about the work, and there was a difference. I was his youngest grandchild, and the only one who ever sat with him long enough to understand what the difference was. After Sunday dinners at his house in Carleton Place, while everyone else moved into the living room, I would follow him to his study and listen to him explain how he had financed his first building on nothing but a handshake and a credit union loan, what he looked for in a long-term tenant, why he had never over-leveraged even during the years when everyone else was borrowing against everything they owned. When he asked me to help him organize his estate paperwork during the last year of his life, I said yes without hesitation. He needed someone careful and patient. I had learned from the best. I had no way of knowing that those afternoons at his desk would eventually become the reason my life came apart. 3 weeks after we buried him, on a gray morning in April, the estate solicitor called an emergency meeting. Nearly $850,000 was missing from accounts that should have been held in trust. Funds that had been sitting in the estate prior to probate distribution had been redirected through a series of transactions nobody could immediately account for. By 9 the next morning, Ottawa police officers were knocking on the door of my apartment in Centretown. They laid it out calmly. Forged transfer authorizations, unauthorized account access, funds systematically redirected in amounts small enough to avoid automatic flags but large enough to add up fast. I stood in my doorway in my socks and asked them to repeat what they had said because I was certain I had misheard. They had not made an error. They had brought a folder. Inside it were printed transaction records and authorization documents bearing a signature that looked exactly like mine. My uncle had provided that folder. The search lasted 4 hours. I sat at my kitchen table and watched 2 officers go through every drawer, every cupboard, every shelf while I kept telling myself it would be sorted out before the afternoon was over. Then one of the officers came out of my storage room carrying a plastic bin. Inside were documents I had never seen, printed banking records with my name across the header, and a small flash drive labeled with my grandfather's initials in permanent marker. I stared at it from across the room and felt something inside me go completely still. No matter how many times I said I had never touched any of those items, the expression on the officers' faces never changed. I had walked into something that had been constructed carefully over a long period of time, and I was the only person in the room who hadn't known it was being built. The story appeared in the Ottawa Citizen by the end of the week. My uncle gave a brief interview outside the estate solicitor's office, looking exhausted and deeply sorrowful, speaking about how difficult it was to come to terms with what had happened inside a family. My aunt stood beside him with her hand on his arm. They looked like people who had absorbed something terrible and were doing their best to carry it with dignity. People I had known my entire life called them brave for speaking publicly. They never answered a single phone call or letter from me. If you've found this channel and you've ever had someone you trusted turn your life upside down, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you're there when the next one comes. When the trial began, I still believed the truth had a shape simple enough to find. What I did not yet understand was how difficult truth becomes to locate when the people constructing the lie have had months to smooth down every edge, and when those people are calm and practiced and appear, to every person in the room, to be grieving. My uncle took the witness stand on the third day. He spoke the way he had always spoken, measured, reasonable, with a quality of reluctant honesty that made everything he said sound like an admission he would have preferred not to make. He told the court that during my grandfather's final months, he had noticed me asking questions about estate account structures that went further than what was needed to file paperwork. He said he had mentioned his concerns to my grandfather, but had not wanted to create conflict when the family was already under stress. He said it had taken him a long time to accept that someone he had watched grow up could have made this choice. My aunt testified the following morning. She cried twice. Both times she paused and pressed her fingers briefly to her lips before continuing, and both times the jury watched her with expressions that told me everything I needed to know about where things were headed. She said she had wanted to believe in me. She said the evidence had made that impossible. Their words carried a weight that nothing I said could balance. The question the jury must have been asking themselves was the same question I heard one juror mouth to another during a recess that I was never supposed to see. Why would they lie about their own family? The jury deliberated for a day and a half. When the forewoman read the verdict, I heard a sound come out of me that I had never heard from myself before. The judge sentenced me to 4 years in a provincial correctional center. As the officer stepped forward with the handcuffs, I turned for a last look at my uncle. He was already looking somewhere else. My aunt was folding a piece of paper and sliding it carefully into her bag. The performance was over, and they were already moving on to whatever came next. The first year inside moved the way time moves when there is nothing to mark it. I woke up each morning to the same walls and the same sounds, and spent the first few seconds each day in a kind of suspension before reality settled back in. The hardest part was not the confinement or the schedule or the loss of privacy. It was the speed at which the outside world simply erased me. My fiancé lasted until late autumn. His letter was kind in a way that made it more difficult to read, not less. He wrote that he had tried to imagine building a life around the uncertainty, and couldn't find a way to do it honestly. He said he hoped I would understand. I read that letter enough times that the paper grew soft and started to separate along the folds. My career disappeared even faster than he did. I had worked as a senior financial administrator for a construction company in Nepean. The moment my name appeared in print beneath the word fraud, that door closed without a sound. The fact that I had spent my entire adult life being meticulous with other people's money, that I had built my professional reputation on precisely the kind of careful record-keeping my grandfather had taught me, made the accusation land with a particular cruelty that I didn't have words for in those early months. Some nights I lay awake running through the sequence of how it had happened. I had been chosen because I was thorough. I had been chosen because I had legitimate access. I had been chosen because I was the one person everyone would believe had a reason to be involved in the estate documents, and therefore the one person who would find it hardest to explain why she hadn't been. Whoever had planned this had known exactly what they were doing and had known me well enough to understand what would be most difficult to disprove. Some nights I wondered whether the truth even had enough mass left to matter. There was one person who never accepted the official version of what had happened. My grandfather had worked with the same notary for over 20 years. She had handled the purchase agreements on his first properties, witnessed his original will, and sat across from him at her desk through more transactions than either of them had counted. After the estate case closed and the conviction became part of the public record, she kept back to the file. Something continued to pull at her. My grandfather had kept his records in a way that other people who work with estate clients describe as unusually thorough. It was not simply financial figures. It was notes, detailed, dated notes about conversations, about decisions made and decisions deferred, about who had been in the room and what had been said. Those notes existed in the same leather-bound ledgers he had kept since the beginning. When police searched his house during the investigation, every single ledger was gone. The official explanation was that he had stopped keeping them consistently in his final year. She had sat across from him regularly during that final year. She had seen him write in those ledgers. She did not believe they had stopped existing. Around the same time, she had begun noticing things about my uncle's life that didn't quite align with the inheritance records on file. A new truck, a significant renovation on the family's cottage in the Laurentians, a 3-week winter vacation to Portugal in February, that he had mentioned casually, and she had filed away without thinking about it until she started thinking about everything. None of it was proof of anything. All of it was wrong. Then one Thursday afternoon, a plain envelope arrived at her office with no return address. Inside was a single photocopied page. It took her a moment to recognize the handwriting. When she did, she set it flat on her desk and did not move for several seconds. It was a page from one of my grandfather's ledgers. Most of the page was ordinary, dated property notes, a tenant reminder, a maintenance question about a roof. Then, near the bottom, written in his careful and unhurried hand, "If anything happens before the estate is fully settled, Jenna must not authorize any transfers without my notary present." She read it 4 times. Then she called a colleague she trusted and asked her to come to the office. My grandfather had not been a man who wrote things down for dramatic effect. He wrote things down because they were important, and because he believed that documentation was the most reliable form of memory. He had used my name. He had used the word must. That meant he had already been worried, and he had already thought through what might need to happen if his worry turned out to be justified. Without telling anyone else, she pulled every estate filing from the last 3 months of his life and began comparing them against his medical records from the palliative care unit where he had spent his final weeks. The timeline did not hold up. 3 documents bore my grandfather's signature on dates when nursing notes described him as minimally responsive due to pain management. On one date where a key authorization document claimed his approval, the attending nurse had recorded that he had not been alert enough to carry on a conversation. The signatures and the medical record could not both be true. Someone had not only forged my name, they had forged my grandfather's handwriting as well, and they had done it during a period when they had calculated he would be unable to contradict anything. She had a pattern now. What she did not yet have was evidence that could stand in front of a judge. She kept returning to something my grandfather had mentioned to her years earlier, almost as an aside during a meeting about one of his property purchases. He had said that he kept important estate documents in 2 places because he did not trust a single location. He had not specified where the second location was, and she had not asked at the time. She had assumed he meant a bank safety deposit box. When she contacted the major branches around Ottawa and Carleton Place, none of them had a box registered to his name. Then she remembered that he had banked with his local credit union his entire life. He had opened his first account there before any of the major institutions had branches anywhere near where he grew up, and he had stayed loyal out of something more than habit. She called the branch in Carleton Place on a Tuesday morning. There was, in fact, a sealed envelope registered to the estate of her longtime client. It had been held in trust for 3 years. No one had inquired about it because no one had known to look. She drove there the same afternoon. The envelope was small and dusty and sealed with tape that had started to lift at one corner. On the front, in my grandfather's handwriting, were 6 words. "In case something does not feel right." Her hands were not entirely steady when she opened it. Inside was a USB drive. The folders were organized with the same careful logic my grandfather brought to every system he ever built. The first contained video recordings made on a laptop camera over a period of about 4 months. In each video, my grandfather sat at his desk and spoke directly at the lens, calm and deliberate, the way he had always spoken when something mattered. He named dates and described specific conversations with my uncle about the estate. He described pressure my uncle had applied on 2 separate occasions to move certain assets before probate, and how each time he had declined, and how each time my uncle had dropped the subject without appearing to accept the answer. In one recording, he paused and looked briefly off camera before continuing. He said he did not want to believe his son was capable of what he was beginning to suspect. He said he had lived long enough to know that love and dishonesty could exist in the same person at the same time. The second folder held scanned copies of the missing ledger pages, every transaction and conversation from the final 8 months of his life. The pages made it immediately clear that my role had been entirely administrative. I had organized and filed documents. I had never been asked to access estate accounts directly, and I never had. The third folder contained something she had not expected. My grandfather had saved original copies of documents that had been brought to him for signature and then quietly replaced with altered versions when they were returned. He had photographed the replacements beside the originals. He had been building his own record of what was being done to his estate while it was being done. He had known the shape of what was coming. He simply had not known how far it would extend after he was no longer there to object. The final file was a short note addressed to her by name. He asked her to use her judgment. If everything had resolved as he hoped, the envelope would never need to be opened. If she was reading this, it meant something had gone wrong and he trusted her to do what was right. He said he was sorry to leave her with it. He signed it the way he signed everything, his full name, dated. She filed emergency motions with the Ontario Court of Justice the same week. The court approved a formal review. Independent forensic document examiners worked through the trial evidence for 6 weeks. Their conclusion confirmed what the USB drive had already shown. The signatures used to convict me were not mine. The pen pressure, the letter construction, the natural variation pattern that appears in genuine handwriting, none of it matched. The signatures were skilled imitations, but they were imitations. My grandfather's signatures on the signed document showed identical problems. RCMP financial investigators traced the missing $850,000 from the point of origin, rather than accepting the version of events from my original trial. The money had flowed through 2 numbered companies registered in Alberta. The directors of record were third parties with no obvious connection to my family, but beneficial ownership documentation, obtained through court-ordered corporate registry access, pointed directly to my uncle. From those companies, the funds had been distributed in regular transfers to a holding company, registered in both my uncle's and aunt's names. The paper trail was not sophisticated once someone's was actually willing to follow it. When the Crown Attorney's Office conducted a fresh review of the original disclosure file, they identified financial records that had existed at the time of my trial, but had never been shared with my defense. Whether the omission had been an error, or something more deliberate was placed under separate review. What it meant for my case was straightforward. The jury that convicted me had never seen a complete picture of the evidence. I was not told any of this while it was happening. I had spent 4 years learning not to hold on to things I couldn't touch. Then one morning in late October, I was brought to a meeting room and introduced to a lawyer I had never met. She set a folder on the table between us and told me she had news. I did not try to stop crying. There was no reason to anymore. My uncle and aunt did not wait for the hearing date to be confirmed. As soon as the first court filings became public record, they began making plans. Flights booked through a travel account that hadn't been used in 2 years. Money shifted into dormant accounts. Their house in Nepean listed quietly with an agency that specialized in fast transactions. Federal investigators had been watching the accounts since the review began. They were stopped at Pearson International Airport in Toronto 2 hours before a flight to Lisbon was scheduled to board. I saw the footage later, after everything was over. The composure my uncle and aunt had carried through every moment of my trial, the measured sorrow, the reluctant honesty, the grief performed so convincingly that it had sent me to prison, all of it was gone. They looked exactly like people who had run completely out of room. My conviction was overturned before the new hearing concluded. A correctional officer knocked on my cell door on a Tuesday morning and said it was time to go. I packed the few things I still owned into a bag that wasn't even close to full, which said everything that needed to be said about what the previous 5 years had cost. Walking out felt nothing like I had imagined. I had pictured feeling light, released, as if something had physically lifted. Instead, I stood in the parking lot and looked at the sky, and felt very far from everything, including myself. The world had kept moving without me. I had to find a way back into it from a standing start. The sentencing hearing came 8 months later. My uncle received 9 years. My aunt received 6. As the officers stepped forward, I sat in the back of the courtroom and thought about my grandfather, sitting alone at his desk, writing into a ledger in his careful hand, recording every conversation my uncle had pushed on him, saving every replaced document, preparing a USB drive in a sealed envelope at a credit union branch, doing everything he could from where he was, for a situation he hoped would never come. The civil proceedings returned what remained of the stolen funds and awarded additional compensation for the wrongful conviction. The court acknowledged formally what the previous 5 years had made impossible to deny, that the system had failed to protect me when it should have. I did not use the money to rebuild the life my uncle had imagined I wanted. I set up a small fund through a community legal clinic in Ottawa that provides support for people facing wrongful conviction in financial crime cases. Many of them cannot afford the kind of thorough independent review that eventually saved me. Many of them have no one who refuses to accept the official version and keeps looking anyway. I had my grandfather's notary. I had his foresight and his faith in the right person. I wanted to make sure that at least some people who had neither of those things had somewhere to turn. Old friendships came back slowly and in different forms. Some people admitted they had believed what they read, because it was easier than sitting with uncertainty. Some relatives called with careful apologies, saying they wished they had spoken up, or pushed back, or simply picked up the phone. I listened to every one of those conversations. Some felt genuine. Some felt like people trying to relieve themselves of something they had been carrying. I decided I could accept apologies without immediately deciding what they meant for the future. Forgiveness is not the same thing as trust, and I had spent 5 years learning exactly where one ends and the other begins. There was one place I had not been able to bring myself to go. About 3 weeks after the sentencing, on a Saturday morning, when the first frost had settled across the grass overnight, I drove out to the cemetery in a Carleton Place, where my grandfather was buried. I had not been there since the funeral. Every time I had thought about going, I ended up back in the spring after he died, and I could not hold those weeks in my memory without everything that followed rushing in alongside them. I brought white flowers, the dried kind he used to keep on his desk in winter, from his garden, arranged in a jar that he would leave on the windowsill until March. I crouched down and set them against the headstone and stayed there without saying anything for a while. Then I found the words. I told him I was sorry I hadn't seen it coming. I told him I understood now what he had been trying to do, and that it had worked, even though it had taken longer than either of us would have wanted. I told him the thing I thought about most was not the years I had lost, but the fact that he had known. He had already known that I would need someone in my corner, and he had made sure that person was there. The wind moved through the bare trees along the edge of the cemetery. I stood and looked at his name on the stone for another minute before I turned toward the car. There were years behind me that would never come back. A relationship that ended in a letter worn soft from too much handling. A version of my career that no longer existed in the form it once had. A chunk of my 30s that would always be there when I looked back, unchanged and unchangeable. But there was also this. My grandfather had built something honest over 40 years, in ledgers dated and shelved in careful order, in a sealed envelope left at a credit union with 6 words written on the front, in the trust he had placed in one person to look in the right place if something ever felt wrong. The truth he had protected outlasted every lie that had been told to bury it. I sat in the car and waited for the frost to clear from the windshield. A Tim Hortons cup I hadn't thrown out was still in the cup holder from the drive over. The heat clicked on, and I watched the glass slowly clear from the center outward. For 5 years, the worst part of being inside had not been the routine or the walls or the loss of everything familiar. It had been the fear that the truth had already become irrelevant, that the wrong story had been filed away and sealed, and that no one with the power to reopen it would ever decide it was worth the effort. But my grandfather had understood something I needed 5 years to learn. The truth does not vanish because it has been buried. It waits. And if you are lucky enough to have been loved by someone careful enough to plan for the worst, and if the right person refuses to walk away, it finds its way back into the light exactly when it is needed most.